Hello, friends. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos, where we discuss communication with people who are different than you. And since we're all unique, that's pretty much everyone. When someone has a different style of communication, they can seem like a weirdo. And if they seem that way to you, you probably seem that way to them. As I like to say, everyone's kind of a weirdo. We're going to talk about some of the assumptions that we make and other pitfalls of communication so that we can all improve. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos. Today we have a very special guest, Michael Segovia. He is a principal consultant with the Myers-Briggs Company, and he's been there for over 35 years. He's facilitated programs all over the world. He's even been quoted in things like Fast Company and the Wall Street Journal, and he's done a TED Talk. So I want to learn more about what it takes to do a TED Talk. I'm so excited to have you here today because I reference the MBTI all the time in my talks. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Jeremy, for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Wonderful. I can't wait to hear what you have to say because, as I said, I reference it all the time, but it's nice to have an actual expert. So how did you get into this field anyway? What excited you about it, and how did that start out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I finished graduate school, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. A classmate of mine interviewed for a job at a test publishing company in San Antonio where I was living then, and I learned about it. I interviewed as well, and I ended up getting the job. So I got into that field. I then left that after about a year, moved to California, and then I ran into the person who ended up hiring me at the Myers-Briggs Company in an airport. There's an example of, even though I prefer introversion, I told myself, I know that guy. I remember him from a meeting years ago. Go up and say hi, which is not typically what I would do. I did, and over 35 years later, I'm still at the Myers-Briggs Company. We were then known as Consulting Psychologist Press. We became CPP, and now we're the Myers-Briggs Company.
Why did they make that change?
It was a lot about what people know us by. People know us by the Myers-Briggs. So when I would talk to people, I would say I work for CPP. They would look at me and I would say we're the publisher of the Myers-Briggs Company, and then people would go, "Oh," because it is the most widely known and used personality assessment in the world, and so we changed that name. We do have other assessments. We have the Strong Interest Inventory, which looks at your vocational interests, the FIRO-B, which looks at your interpersonal needs, the TKI, which looks at conflict, the CPI, which is looking at this idea around leadership and somewhat around helping people understand development and growth from there.
That is fantastic. I'm going to have to explore some of those other tools
Sure.
because I haven't been aware of them. I'm glad that you shared that with us. So you said that you tend to be an introvert. Can you explain, but you acted as an extrovert, essentially. Can you explain that a little bit more of what these things actually mean, if they're just tendencies, if they're who
Sure.
you are, what it is?
Yeah, and it goes back to the importance of type language, where I actually avoid using words like extrovert and introvert because those words, in a way, limit us. They sort of put us into a box. And instead, we want to think about having a preference for extroversion or having a preference for introversion. And then that lets us understand that while we have a preference for one over the other, of course, we use both. And I was listening to your podcast around thinking and feeling, and you mentioned that as well, that while we might prefer one over the other, we all actually, when it comes to making a decision, use both thinking and feeling. When it comes to extroversion and introversion, it's really about where do we get our energy. People who prefer extroversion get their energy from the outer world of action and people and things. People who prefer introversion, like me, get our energy from this inner world of ideas and reflection. And I'm really good in the world when you give me that opportunity to reflect on something, then I'm ready to talk about it. If you don't give me that time, then it's harder for me to just sort of tell a story if I haven't had time to really think about it. It makes me think of, I was at my high school reunion just this past weekend. It was our 43rd reunion. We were going to have a 40th, but we know what happened 3 years ago, so we didn't have that reunion. And I was pretty good in that environment when I was at a table with people I knew. It was perfectly fine for me. Well, when those people left, I had to stay because I was on the reunion committee. Then I thought, oh no, now I have to talk to people I don't know as well. And it can be difficult for those of us who prefer introversion to have to do that. Small talk can feel like pulling teeth for those of us who prefer introversion. However, we can do it if we think about flexing, if we think about stretching. So it's why I'm not really an introvert. I have a preference for introversion, but I can flex over to that extroversion side. And I need to flex, like we all need to flex to be a productive and effective person in work and in life.
Yeah, I have a strong preference towards introversion, and yet I spend almost all of my time interacting with people, and I just afterwards need to go home and rest and be by myself. I love to run, and I don't listen to music because it gives me an opportunity to just let all the thoughts in my brain run their
Mhm.
course.
Yeah, that's why I go swimming at lunchtime. I get in the pool, and all I'm focused on are my laps. Have I counted right? I'm not thinking about everything else. And then once I finish my laps, I'm completely re-energized. It's like somebody plugged me into the wall, and wow, I'm ready to go with whatever the world has to offer me for the rest of the day. You know, Jeremy, you did mention a word that I want to talk about, and you said I'm a strong introvert, or I have a strong preference for introversion. That's another thing that is important with the Myers-Briggs in that it really doesn't tell us how big or small, how strong or weak our preferences are. And it can be confusing for people because when you take the MBTI, by the way, when you take the real MBTI, you get scores. You get something called a probability index. And in the global version of the assessment, which is the newest version, which was revised in the end of 2018, the range is from 50 to 100. So when I take the MBTI, I get a probability index of 52, which means I'm right there near the middle. And really what that number is telling me, it's not telling me weak or small, it's telling me the probability that if I were to take this assessment again, that I would get a similar result or not. And so it's hard for us because we see these numbers and we think, oh, it's telling us about strength, when in fact it's more about how likely it is that you would get the same result if you were to take the assessment again.
Is it also how likely that that's your preference in multiple different scenarios?
You know, it could be, however, you would have to tell me that. So if I'm talking to you about the MBTI and you say, you know, Michael, I report a 95 on the introversion side. That's a probability index of 95 closing in on 100. I would then ask you, Jeremy, so how does that preference help you in your work and in your life? And how might it not? And then you would tell me, you know, here's how it helps me. Here's how it doesn't. Here's how I use it, how much I use it. The number won't necessarily tell us that. For example, you know, I mentioned I report right near the middle, and yet if you know me well, without a doubt, no question whatsoever, introversion is my preference. Why I report near the middle is about my culture. I'm Mexican American, and my culture very much encourages, very much favors the extroversion side. So when I answer questions on the MBTI, I answer a lot on the extroversion side because of that cultural expectation. However, in the end, again, if you knew me well, no question whatsoever, you would say, yeah, Michael prefers introversion.
Oh, I have so many questions. I have to keep them in mind. So I'll ask this most recent one.
Sure.
How much of, say, this one, introversion and extroversion, is innate and something you're born with, and how much of it is cultural?
Yeah, well, the theory is that these preferences are what we call inborn predispositions. The theory is we're born with these preferences, and then our environment will impact how we express them. So if you're born into an environment, for example, I know somebody with preferences for ENFP, often described as the most enthusiastic of the types. She grew up, though, where her mother taught her and told her young women are seen, not heard. I think kind of a tragic story if you ask me. And so she grew up thinking, well, something must be wrong with me. I have to tone it down. And so there's an example of somebody who prefers extroversion who early on in her life didn't look like she preferred extroversion. It wasn't until she was able to be the person she was meant to be that that extroversion really manifested, if you will.
Yeah, that's got to be hard being forced into something that you're
Very
not
much
natural.
so. Yeah.
So another question that I had from before, you mentioned that that was one misconception. Are there other misconceptions people have about the tests or the assessments?
Yeah. So there's one right there. So some people will describe the MBTI as a test when in fact we describe it as an assessment. When we use words like test, it implies good or bad, pass or fail. So we want to get away from that and describe it as an assessment, or even better, an indicator. That's what the I in MBTI stands for, where it's an indication of what your preferences might be. A really good indication, however, in the end, as you put it all together by doing a self-estimate where you explore what they might be, looking at your reported type, which is how you answered questions on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and then putting it all together to then decide what your preferences might be. So we don't use words like test or exam, instead assessment. We used to say instrument, that works as well, or indicator. In fact, the Myers family often described this as the indicator whenever I was in meetings with them.
I will try to refrain from
Cool.
using test again.
Great.
So this podcast is all about communication. I'm wondering if you can maybe go through the different types and some of the communication challenges that they can have, and if you have suggestions for how to overcome them, that would be great.
Sure, and I would even recommend visit our website, and if you go down to the bottom of it, you'll see all of these great resources where there's a webinar and two or three or four, I've done a few of them around type and communication. So starting with extroversion and introversion, again, it's where you get your energy. And so often the communication challenges that could come up when you have those differences is a person who prefers extroversion might overwhelm the conversation for someone who prefers introversion. And then let's look at the opposite side. A person who prefers introversion might underwhelm that conversation for a person who prefers extroversion. So it's something I try to stay aware of when I'm talking to someone, when I'm communicating with someone, and I have an idea of what their preferences might be. In my case, because I prefer introversion, amp it up a bit. Or I think of when I'm working with someone who prefers extroversion, try not to get offended when maybe I'm saying something and they interrupt me. Why people who prefer extroversion interrupt? It's not typically because they're being rude or they're not listening. It's because they're excited about what you said, and so they want to jump in too. So I try to remind myself, take it as a compliment, not as an insult, even though sometimes I think, well, I'm not done yet. Just try to think about it in that opposite way, if you will, that different way.
That's so interesting because what I found is that most people interrupt each other. So if I'm in a group of 4 or 5, there's never a break and there's never a chance for me to talk.
Yeah.
So I'll actually raise my hand,
Yeah.
and so that they'll know that they're like, okay, Jeremy's got next. And then I have had to come up with strategies so that when I pause, they don't just jump in there.
So true.
Do you have any good strategies for that?
Yeah, well, that happened to me just this weekend at the reunion where somebody asked, "What do you do?" And so that's kind of hard to explain. So I started explaining it. I paused, and then you could see the energy went away. And so one of my strategies is don't take it personal. It's perfectly okay. It just maybe was more information than they needed at that point in time. And if they want more info, they'll ask for more information. So I think that first strategy is don't take it personally, which maybe early on in my life I might. I might also, at the beginning of when I'm saying something, say, I have three things I want to say there. So if I said two, they know I have one more, and that might be a strategy. If they're really interested, they'll wait for that third point.
That's wonderful. I do that as well
Yeah.
because I found if I don't, then I'll never get to 2 or 3. That's wonderful. How about some of the other indicators?
Sure. So sensing and intuition, it's how you take in information. So people who prefer sensing take in information in a very detailed step-by-step way versus people who prefer intuition take in information in more of a big picture, general way. So when I'm communicating with people, by the way, I prefer intuition. That doesn't mean I don't use sensing, but my preference is on the intuition side. And if I'm communicating with somebody who prefers sensing, instead of starting big picture and jumping from theme to theme to theme, which is how I prefer to communicate, I remember to start in the beginning and go step by step. I know when I don't do that, I lose people. I think of my partner who prefers sensing. I can go all over the place. And he'll look at me and he'll say, "What are you talking about?" And I'll say, "Oh, let me start at the beginning." And when I do that, he really gets where I'm going. He's currently out of town, and so every night we talk at 9 o'clock, and he'll start with his day, and he'll start, I woke up, and then I did this, and then I went there, and then I realized when he asks me about my day, that's what I need to do as well, instead of jumping all over the place. By the way, when I communicate with people who prefer intuition, if I go step by step like that, you'll see their eyes will start to glaze over. So I have learned big picture information, and if they want more than that, I'll give them more than that.
It's so interesting. I was just talking to a bunch of engineers yesterday about
Ah,
communication
yeah.
on this topic, and the example that I used is learning to play a new game, a new board game or new card game. It drives me crazy when people are telling me every single step. I'll glaze over, and then when they're done talking, I'll then ask the couple things I want to know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I drive them crazy because I'll say, here's the goal, and we'll figure it out as we go. They're like, no, I need all the steps.
I completely agree. When people give me too many steps, because of my intuition preference, I don't remember them anyway. I think step one was, what was step two? I don't remember them. So in a way, it feels like we kind of wasted a lot of time here. Instead of just giving me the general idea, then let me go. I'm perfectly fine going from there.
Yep. So far, we are 2 for 2. We're both INs.
We both prefer intuition. We both prefer introversion. We both prefer intuition. The next preference pair is around thinking and feeling, and that's how we make decisions. So people who prefer thinking make decisions in a very logical, task-focused way, versus people who prefer feeling make decisions considering how those decisions impact people and how those decisions relate to their values. So a very big difference here. I prefer feeling. I've heard your podcast, so I know which side you prefer. I'm not going to say unless you want to share now. And feel
I
free which
prefer
side.
thinking.
Yeah, so you and I, when it comes to making a decision, would likely come from a very different perspective. However, if we can bring those differences together, there's where we can make the best decisions, if you will, because we're considering the task and we're considering how that decision will impact people. There's where we get I think, a better decision. So I've learned when I communicate with people around making a decision, I need to maybe get to, all right, so here's the decision and here's the return on investment we're going to make from that decision. That's addressing the thinking side. If I just say to you, Jeremy, people are going to be happier, you're going to wonder, wait, why is that important? Maybe it is at some level, but maybe not most important. By the way, if you come to me and say, if we make this decision, we're going to make $1 billion. I'm going to say, yeah, but how will that impact people? Will it hurt people? Will it help people? That's where I'm going to start. And sure, I'm interested on the thinking side. However, my focus is really about, but does it relate to my values? Because if it doesn't connect to my values, you're going to have a really hard time convincing me. And guess what? We need people to make decisions happen. So if you can connect to my values, I'm going to be your biggest champion to make that decision happen.
When I was in high school, I worked as a supervisor at an amusement park, and they had all of us take the MBTI assessment.
Hmm.
And then we had a 2-day course on it. And my preferences, my scores are very high on most things. So she would put me in groups with people like me. And then it was great to see how we all thought and processed and then compared it to the other people.
Hmm.
But on the thinking and feeling as an experiment, she took me and put me with all the feeling people. And we had to try and come to a decision on something. And she had to separate us because I thought that they were being ridiculous and they thought I was being a monster. She's like, okay, let's stop this experiment now.
Well, and the value there is helping you see, wow, there's a different way to make a decision. Who knew? And eventually, as we develop and grow, we learn, and there's something I can learn from that different side. Early on, it just seems so foreign to people. And yet, as we develop and grow, and that's really what Jung believed our growth is about, learning how to appreciate the side we prefer, and then learning how to appreciate that opposite side. There's where we learn to make the best decisions of our life.
Yeah, it really was so eye-opening because you kind of logically know that other people are different than you on some of these, but when you really get into an example like that, you're like, oh, it's for real. It's not
That,
just theory.
I like your word there. We kind of logically know that's someone who prefers thinking. That's a word that you would typically say.
Yep. Probably too much. But
Not at all. Not at all.
and then what's the fourth?
The fourth is judging and perceiving, and that's how do we organize our external world. Now, sometimes people will misunderstand judging and perceiving. Judging, they'll think, oh, that means I'm being judgmental, when in fact, judging is about coming to a decision like a judge comes to a decision using thinking and feeling. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. And then perceiving is about continuing to take in information, keeping our options open using sensing and intuition. So judging and perceiving. By the way, this is the preference pair where I do see the most conflict in work teams, where you have a team member who prefers judging, who likes to come to closure, who likes to check things off and move on, versus people who prefer perceiving. They like to keep their options open. They like to consider new information along the way. And if you ask them to check things off too soon, that's where they feel boxed in, where they feel limited. And I've seen team members really get into some issues when it comes to those differences. Let's say you have a leader who prefers judging, and they have a group of people who report to them who prefer perceiving. It might make that leader who prefers judging uncomfortable when the team isn't maybe on a 30-day project, starting at day one and moving forward each day to complete it. Because people who prefer perceiving, we often call them pressure prompted. I prefer perceiving. I'm pressure prompted, where on day one, I don't really know what it means. It needs to bake in the oven like a cake bakes in the oven. And then right before it's due, I can take it out of the oven and, oh, there it is. Now I know the answer. That's that pressure prompted approach. That can make it uncomfortable for the early starting approach for people who prefer judging. Or switch it if you have a team leader who prefers perceiving and their members prefer judging, and that leader knows about a project, but they don't tell the team about it until a couple of days before. That can be very stressful for that team who wonders, well, wait, you need me to now do it now? I'm working on all these other things as well. It can be really stressful for people who prefer judging. They need to start early, not later in that pressure prompted approach.
The place where I see it the most, and I think is an example most people can relate to, is planning a vacation. There are some people who absolutely need to know all the details of the vacation, and then there are people like me who I just want to get there and then we'll figure it out at the time. And luckily, we understand that about each other, my girlfriend and I. So
Yeah.
we recognize it, but if we weren't careful, it would drive both of us crazy.
And Jeremy, you're bringing up for me with the MBTI, we've been talking about what's called the MBTI Step 1, which looks at these preference pairs of ENI, SNN, TNF, and JMP. There is an extended version called the MBTI Step 2. And on the MBTI Step 2, I actually report out of preference. So I prefer perceiving, but when it comes to leisure or long-range planning, I'm over on the planful side. So I am that person when it comes to leisure, where I plan every single bit of it. I'm currently working with a group of my cousins. We're going to Alaska next summer, and I'm the one who's saying, we need to plan our excursions now. We need to book this now. And if you didn't know me and you knew my preference was for perceiving, you would assume I prefer judging, when in fact that's just how I'm different from other people who prefer perceiving. By the way, step 2 gives us information around the diversity within the expression of our type, how we might be different from people of the same type based on things we've learned over the course of our lives. I've learned to plan leisure because I'm in a family, my parents, who don't plan any of it. And as a result, we ended up sleeping in the parking lot of Disney World when I was a kid. In the middle of the summer, I was devoured by mosquitoes. And so from then on, I look like I prefer judging when it comes to leisure, even though I don't overall.
That's interesting because that is the one where, for me, it's very different depending on
Yeah.
the situation. There's like vacations. I absolutely don't want to plan anything, but in my work life, a lot of times, like I refuse to go to a meeting if there's no agenda because
I
it just
see.
seems like it's not going to be a good use of my time.
If you're interested, I want to invite you to take the MBTI Step 2 as long as you'll spend time with me walking you through it. And based on what you shared, my guess is there could be some interesting things come up
That
around judging and perceiving. Who knows, other preference pairs as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I
Fun,
appreciate
good.
that. So you mentioned earlier taking the real MBTI, are there a
Sure.
lot of others online, or what are people seeing, using, and what should they be seeing and using?
Sure. So if you want to take the real MBTI, you can go to mbtionline.com, all one word, mbtionline.com. That's a place where you can take the assessment and then you go through what's called a self-assessment, where after you answer the questions or the items, you learn what these preference pairs are about, and then you hypothesize what you think your preference might be, all online. Once you do that, then you get information around how you answered questions on the assessment, and then you put it all together to then decide what you think your preferences might be. We call that your best fit type. There's a lot more content related to type on mbtionline.com as well. Now, you could also take the MBTI with a certified practitioner. And so you can look for someone who is certified on the assessment. I certify people to take the MBTI. It's a 4-day program where you learn about the assessment and you learn about the ethical and practical use of the assessment. You get into something called type dynamics, where you learn there is no such thing as an extrovert or an introvert because all of us use both. And in fact, when it comes to our preferences, I extrovert intuition. I'm using the word extrovert there as a verb. I introvert feeling. So I have an extroverted side and I have an introverted side, just like you do. And by the way, that certification program, it is 4 days, and there is an exam at the end of it that you have to pass to become certified. But again, if you want to just take it yourself, mbtionline.com.
Wonderful. You mentioned, I think I heard this correctly, after getting the results, you then go through and you kind of give your own personal feedback on where you think you are. Is that right?
So a little bit different. So you take the assessment. Before you get your results or how you answered questions, you learn about it. So you've answered if let's say you've taken step one, you've answered the 92 questions. There's where then you learn about what is E and I. This is after you've taken it. What is E and I? What is S and N? What's T and F? What's J and P? Then once you do that, you then get information around here's how you answer those questions. Then you put it all together, because sometimes how you self-estimate might be different from how you answer the questions on the MBTI. And so there's where you want to put it together. By the way, more often than not, if somebody has a difference between their self-estimate and how they answered questions on the MBTI, it's because they reported near the middle. Like I report for introversion just a 52, 53. I'm right there in the middle. So I could answer just a few questions different and move over to the other side. If you answer near the ends, like near 100, it's really rare for somebody to answer that many questions different to then report over on the other side.
Got it. And would it be worthwhile to get someone else's take? I've seen some other assessments where the results will come back and a person's like, I don't think this is right. And everyone else in the room is like, oh, it's right. Does that ever happen?
I think it's really important to open yourself up to talk to people who you know well, just to get another point of view. I'll have people say to me, I prefer thinking, but I'm really good at flexing over on the feeling side. I consider people's feelings. I ask people how the decision is impacting them, and then I'll ask them, challenge yourself by asking people, do you do that as much as you think you do? And when they come back, they'll say, well, I thought I was doing that. And other people tell me they barely even notice it. So sure, challenge yourself by seeking out people who know you well, just to get another point of view, if you will.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Well,
Sure.
Michael, as we start to wrap up, I have 3 questions I like to ask everybody.
Great.
And the first one is, what's a place you've traveled to that you loved and a place you would like to go?
I was in Portugal this past March. I loved it. Beautiful country, amazing food. I love wine. Really loved Porto was my favorite city. We really enjoyed our time there. Where do I want to go? Kind of sad, maybe. Last Christmas we were supposed to be in Antarctica, but the airline let us down and we didn't make it there in time, so the ship sailed without us. So I want to go back. I want to go to Antarctica. What was the third question? There was another question I thought I
Well,
saw.
that was really just
Oh,
one question with
okay.
parts A and B.
Okay.
Who do you think is a great communicator, whether it is a public figure or just someone in your own personal life?
I'm going to get a shout out to my manager, Sherry Haney, who has very different preferences from me and yet flexes beautifully to her entire team. She knows I prefer introversion, so she knows give Michael space, and when he's ready, he'll reach out to me. She knows I prefer perceiving, so she's never on my case about when is it going to be due. She knows it's going to be there and it's going to be as good as anybody else's. So I have an amazing manager, and I feel lucky that I get to work with her and for her.
That might help be part of the reason why you've stayed there so long.
I bet it is. I work with amazing people at the Myers-Briggs Company.
Nice. And then the final question is, what is one piece of communication advice that you think everyone can use?
I love that. Yeah, a big piece of communication advice is to recognize that there are people different from us. And if we can learn to appreciate and value those differences, that's where our communication becomes not just twice as good if you're working with someone who's different from you. It's 10, 20, 100 times as good. I can think of somebody years ago I worked with, very, very different from us. We actually couldn't stand each other when we started working together. We brought in the MBTI, and our relationship began with, I can't stand you too. I actually love you. And she was the person that I relied on the most. I was the person she relied on the most when it came to our work. And it was about understanding those communication differences.
It's so interesting. Was it because she was very different from you on a lot of the things?
Sensing intuition difference, judging perceiving difference. Very different for us. Yep.
Got it. Yeah, and it's hard to deal with people who are so different than you, but it's so useful because you obviously, I obviously have a lot of blind spots that the other person will be able to see. So
yeah, we can all stretch. It's just about being willing and being open. And luckily, we were at a place of let's sit down, let's explore those differences. And we really were. We were the two, we came together and became these best friends. And without the MBTI, honestly, it would not have happened.
that is fantastic, Michael. I've been so happy to have you here today. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else has. So I want to thank you deeply for joining me today.
And thank you, Jeremy. It's been great being here, great talking to you. And I want to hold you to, if you want to take the MBTI step too, I'd love to spend time with you doing that.
I will absolutely do that. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks for listening to another episode of How to Talk to Weirdos. Hopefully you found it both interesting and useful. If either of those things is true, please share. Do you have a friend or a coworker who could benefit from listening? Maybe a family member you're going to be spending the holidays with? Please send them a link to your favorite episode and see if your conversations don't get just a little bit easier. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a great week.